for the urgencies in our communities and making those spaces available, it's a priority.
That's well put. Next question. Here's one that I've seen stir up a lot of debate and conversation. What is your opinion about Occupy LA?
That first guy got answer. Would you know, like, you? I think we have to like be honest about the fact that that everything's a process. You can't go A to Z. In like one quick snapperoo, because you have everyone as deep as the brainwashing is, as deep as the dominant culture through its media outlets has everybody entrenched in this Wall Street paradigm. Many people have different understandings, and as such, we have to be honest about the fact that it's not going to be like this magical, rebellion moment. It's going to be incremental, if at best, really. But the thing is to maintain dialogue. Like the Zapatistas talk about maintaining dialogue and respect, about getting to another place of consciousness, of getting to a real place of where we are tearing down the power structures for a better world. So, I mean, if anything, that's really my opinion and comment.
I won't generalize because I know talking about Occupy, there's different groups that are a part of that, but based on our experience, my personal experience, my experience as part of a collective, we don't work with the police ever. And that's something I can't say about Occupy. That was something from the get-go. A lot of people were exposed. That's something that, again, speaks to white privilege, speaks to white supremacy in our society, where people of color, our issues and our urgencies are second. Our issues always come after. And so where you have folks that are down to go camp out, have social events, but at the same time calling the pigs or treating folks that live in the streets differently, calling folks that are undocumented, calling the pigs on them. So it was this huge disconnect from the reality. I mean, we're in LA, a very superficial city. What ended up happening was something that was staged. I mean, for us, having a lot of our comrades that were basically put on blast, having their pictures thrown out, given information, basically doing the job of the police for the police, having, the effect of people, unsafe spaces for a lot of our compañeros. It's something that, it was unfortunately not a safe space, another safe space for people of color. I know other compañeros are doing the struggling, trying to work, but for us, it was something where we even, we're on the grind. We do a mutual aid food program every Sunday in MacArthur Park. This November will be 5 years. We don't believe in occupation. For us, it's about liberating space, autonomy, and it's creating safe space for the community. And throughout the years, we've struggled to not have to deal with the police, not have to we've had to deal with them, but we've always struggled on our own. And having folks like the Occupy LA come in and do their picnics, having them then turn around and call the police on us for stupid shit for a parking space. And so it just becomes the reality of white privilege, where people at the end of the day, pick and choose certain things that speak to them and are willing to disregard the issues, the realities of communities of color, the urgencies of low-income communities. And so, unfortunately, for me, it's a negative opinion of what Occupy LA is, and what it did, and it's hard to say what it accomplished in regards for people of color and for pushing for us. And we always got to be conscious. Anything that's brought to us by the media, that's promoted on Facebook, that's not coming from the people. Anything that's being pushed and working simultaneously with the authorities is not really being brought to you by the people, and it's only going to be given so much space to go so far. So if we're really talking about change, not just something on the surface, we need to go deeper than that. So,
I agree with both what y'all said. I think simply for me, one of the first things I would say is that I am not the 99%. As a queer woman, migrant of color, I come from many percentages, and if a movement or a group of people cannot understand that and see past or see beyond an economic struggle, then it's not inclusive right? And so that's what I want to say. I spend a lot of time talking about this, and I don't want to, keep going. But another thing too, language. We need to make sure that we're very critical of the language that we use. And yes, like compañero Mauricio said, we don't believe in occupations. We know the U.S. has occupations all over the world, so why would we continue to perpetuate that? Why would we continue to use that language, right? And so all I say is decolonize. Decolonize yourself, decolonize your mind, decolonize your language. And I think that's the way I would do it.
Well, one quick comment I was going to add to that. It's a really interesting perspective that I think that's being brought to the table right now, because it's something that I think that was kind of suppressed in a way, not just largely by the Occupy movement in general, but kind of the way the media reported on it, about just a bunch of people going out in the streets and not being aware of entirely what was going on, but just camping out. And the media kind of said one thing and people were saying a different thing. But overall, I wasn't directly involved in Occupy LA, but from what I saw, it seemed that a lot of people had different opinions, and they kind of were angry at the fact that some people were a little bit politically immature at the fact that the police were going to come in eventually and raid everything and shut everything down. That's why they didn't want to get involved, because they had priors and they were on probation and stuff like that. It just wasn't a safe environment for mostly overall people of color. So I think it's good that there's that type of perspective, especially when talking about Occupy LA. So next question, kind of segueing into this one, what's your personal experience with racism in the movement?
It's ongoing. It's some shit that we struggle for, and so for us, it's like creating our all people of color organization. We work with all allies, but it's putting a priority to our urgencies in our community, because folks come in, it's the shit where even the most conscious folks, through their good deeds, will fuck up and like basically perpetuate the same shit we're out there organizing against. We're out there like trying to build, and it's we don't believe in charity. We work for mutual aid. We work to apply those principles. A lot of the shit that unfortunately doesn't translate to a lot of folks with privilege is that they want to come and talk about shit, and we're done talking. For us, it's about working, building, and so when a lot of our shit is talked about, it's condescending. It's only looked on one level, because we don't engage in those mental masturbation. We're not going to be fucking just going back and forth wasting our time. Folks that have time for it, more power to you, but the shit for us, it's like there's urgencies in our community. We can't waste the time to just keep shooting the shit, talking the same things over and over, debating about the same shit over and over, when there's urgencies, when there's kids in our communities that don't have enough to eat, where there's families that don't have access to healthcare, where there's folks that don't have spots to live, where the police are fucking brutalizing, murdering people. We can't wait to have these conversations, and so for us, me personally, it's been shit, dealing with fools that fucking criticize, me personally or compañeros based on our diets. And look, I don't eat meat, but at the same time, I'm not going to criticize compañeros that eat meat. I'm not going to criticize other communities that have a bigger connection to where their food comes from. They respect, they actually have a balance to somebody that just has the privilege to buy a certain way. And so it's just been something from the most superficial shit to the other shit where through their unconscious racism, where they'll fucking say some fucked up shit, try to touch people's hair, fucking do some stupid shit, all that. And it's the experiences that me and my compañeros that are it's like our family experiences daily by so-called conscious people that continue to do the same old shit. And like, we all make mistakes, but in so many things in terms of white privilege and racism, it's not seen as a mistake. It's just seen, it's just good intentions, or they're naive, but the reality is it's not. You've been told, you've been checked, and it continues to happen. So it's a matter of fact that, it continues to be in the movement, even in the progressive movements, unsafe spaces for people of color.
I think I want to touch on mostly privilege and how important that is to be addressed and to be talked about. And I do think that dialogue is important, because we're gonna, I think we'll get somewhere with that. But again, it always has to go back to practice, right? For me, it's just important, if whether you're white or color, we all have different privileges, just like Mauricio said earlier. And so as people of color like myself, like I have a green card, right? And that's a hell of a privilege because I get to go back home, right? But then for other folks, you know, whether you recognize it or not, you just have to be very, very aware of it. And especially of the space that you take sometimes. I think exactly going back to, you know, why people of color spaces are important is because sometimes we don't feel safe or comfortable speaking in a space where we're not sometimes acknowledged or where other people think they know more or they know better, you know. And I've been through those things and I know how they are. But I think it's important just be conscious of the space you take. You know, that's what I want to say.
Yeah, like I think that it's really a lot of it has to do with like this lack of sense of privilege, you know, like a lot of critique, because like in my experience of you know getting oriented towards so-called anarchism, I had a lot. All my comrades were all white, and so then when it came to trying to talk about engaging the community, because we did this thing in 1984, part of No Business as Usual, where we put locks in we put glue in the bank's doors. We jammed up the phones. We blocked the freeway entrances. Like during that time, it was like, oh, you know, come on, like where you live, you need to get people to come down and organize. You know, try to get people to try to come get in the mix. And how do you do that to people who can't even survive? And they need to work. And here, you know, there's all these single, privileged, you know, probably trust fund anarchist heads, and they're like telling you to get people from the working class community to go down and take part in the things that you were going to do, but you know they're trying to feed their kids, you know, and they're trying to survive, and so. And this lack of understanding or lack of insight or consideration and this romanticized ideas was what, for me, like a pretty big, impactful, eye-opening in terms of like of the different, you know, like this kind of romanticized idea of anarchism, right? Because to me, it's more about being, about setting an example, doing in your community. For example, I live on a block where I have like, I live on a block where I have these, World War II veterans. You know, I have one white neighbor. I have these people from, Jalisco, and really the only way I could really engage them is in terms of discussing ideas. Is just to talk about the basic idea of survival if a catastrophe were to happen. And so, like when you want to engage people, you have to like think about the basic things of survival. Like let's say the catastrophe is going to happen, or let's say there's fires or whatever. That's the way you can really be honest and engage people, because it's really about everyone needs to try to survive, right? But when you have affluent people trying to organize communities of color and not speak to the fact of like basic people's survival, that's where like this sense of privilege is like, you ignore this idea of like how you're dealing with poor people, and it goes beyond even just people of color, just even the fact of wanting to survive, right? So I have like this back plot, like that I'm trying to build a garden and discussing with my neighbors. And in that way, even if they're Republican, like poor Republicans, right? Poor Mexican Republicans, if you will, who are trying to be affluent, even just the fact of like, hey, I got this garden in case, and also how the food prices are going up because of this drought going on. It's like that in its own self is a way of discussing, because it's like it becomes a way of like me not even judging them because they're Republican or you know what I'm saying? It's like you speaking to the people, as a basic human being, going beyond the paradigm of like, the super organizer and shit, you know what I mean? And like, we can only organize these people. But you gotta remember that people people have kids, people are trying to survive. You gotta go to them to where they're at. You can't be this idealized sense of like, we're gonna save the world and do all this thing, like probably what went down in Occupy, right? Like all this lack of reality vision, like, So I'm probably rambling now, but anyway, but that's pretty much but my experience is that people don't, like, a lot of times it's like you don't get it, you don't understand, you got to be like what he was saying, you know, you got kids that don't have food. That's where we're at, and that's what you deal with, and that's what's important beyond anything.
I think all those points were really well said, really well put out there. Last question is about the movement. What direction do you see it going in? And if you don't see it going in a direction that's, you know, necessarily productive or effective, how can we get it into that direction? How can we work together to make a movement in a direction that is going to bring about some sort of social change?
Let's see. I think that we need to focus in the communities that we live in, right? Specifically the communities we're from, if that's where we still live. But we need to keep doing that groundwork and that foundation building with our neighbors, with the families, the kids, and really exposing them in a way that they understand about what we're doing, you know, because sometimes people can try to come to these you know, events or gatherings, but they don't really understand. They still leave and they don't understand it, right? So our goal, I think, our purpose is to really make sure that you know, the little kid down the block is getting involved with like RAC, you know, and like how they're doing it, building from the bottom. And I know I'm putting in some work at this collective home in Pacoima that I live in, and we're learning that it's hard sometimes because even our neighbors, you know, are too complacent and too, you know, they don't want to do anything. But I think that's where it's at, and building locally for sure, making sure that we work collectively. We don't need any protagonists of any movement, you know, I don't believe in that, no reformists of any kind. So that's all I can think of now. But
yeah, I would continue that what Karina said. I mean, there's always going to be resistance, but the terms of resistance, what's made available in LA in particular, like our experiences, what's promoted a lot is a nonprofit industrial complex. A lot of folks are pushed into nonprofit sector work, and it basically diminishes the strength of the grassroots. It diminishes the strength of the people to be able to do things on their own without having like a white board of directors actually organizing or actually submitting to what's allowed and what's not. It's part of the shit that happens, the gentrification around MacArthur Park, around the areas we lived in. Part of that, like businesses like Mama's Fat Tamales, which is on the surface, you're gonna look at some shit that's just gonna be, wow, collective, it's helping women, undocumented women be able to sell their food. That sounds great, and it is, because folks need opportunities, but then you have to look further. Some shit that's taking money from the Weeds and Seeds program, that's taking money from the LAPD, those same people create a privilege for that individual small group. So now in turn, everybody that's outside of that gets a PACE called on them. All the other undocumented vendors that aren't part of that collective get the police called on them. So we have to look at some shit where, as far as in LA, I mean, I'm always hopeful because I always see like a lot of folks come out to events, and I meet compañeros that are working and part of different spaces that try to create spaces that are safe, that are trying to create the survival, live better programs that speak to the urgencies of our community. So I'm always hopeful in that regards, because, you know, we have to keep pushing. It's something individually, it's up to, you know, if it's some shit that you're looking for somebody to inspire you, well, you're gonna keep looking for that until, you know, your privilege runs out. So if it's some shit where you actually want to use that privilege, you know, put it to work for somebody else, get to work with folks, you know, put in work, like the physical work. Don't just show up when the cameras are there. Don't just show up when it's like a social event. Show up when somebody needs some shit clean. Show up when fucking, where it's the nitty gritty, the shit that like isn't the glamorous work or whatever. And so, I mean, there's definitely like a lot of potential for the building that's happening in LA, but it's always in the same direction. The authorities are always constantly, they're getting more supplies, they're getting more resources, they're constantly getting, you know, more folks to come and work with them. And unfortunately, movements like Occupy that continue to perpetuate myths that the police are part of the 99% continue to make this work harder for the folks that are actually trying to push further, trying to push from an anti-authoritarian perspective, trying to push for more community, where the grassroots, where the folks in the community, the folks are actually building the institutions that speak to them, that speak to their urgencies, that speak to their families. And it's something that I'm hopeful, I mean, that it continues to grow, and it's just, you know, folks put in work.
I think that the way to do it is, I think, just organize your block. Like organize your block by the commonalities that we all need to survive, right? Like, for example, it's interesting. Like there's this Christian elderly woman on my block, and she was always like, offering food and giving food to people, and oh yeah, like Thanksgiving, whatever, or Christmas, like come around and giving things to people, right? And I was tripping because she was actually engaging people, and everyone was, oh yeah, blah blah blah, and they were, and people were coming over to her house for like before they did their Thanksgiving, whatever, I don't believe in Thanksgiving, but that whole dominant culture holiday. But my point is that she engaged the community, even though her thing was she wanted to save souls and get them to be born again Christians or whatever, right? But that's when I was realizing and looking at that, and also reading other books by people who organize it. And it's really about like not using the isms, because even using anarchism, just like we used to get into it back in the 80s with the RCP. The RCP to us was like, they were like a born again Christians, communist born again Christians, like jamming it down their throat, like, hey, blah blah blah, and don't you know, and the ruling class, and blah blah blah, and once you even say that, because the way whenever you say, even people when they hear the word anarchy trip out, right? So what, like she was saying, like, got to think about our semantics, like, do not even use it, just set the example, like for example, like water, right? There's a desert farming where you collect water, and what would be wrong, like going up and down your block and saying, yo, like trip out, like in case there's ever a water problem, because like you never know, blah blah blah. Not using fear, right? But just using, like, maybe if an earthquake happens, I'm trying to collect water for everybody. Like, what do you think about blah blah blah? And then that way you engage people, even the Republican neighbor. You know what I mean? And then even in that process, and you start dialoguing, like, yeah, blah blah blah. You discuss, and it's not like you're proselytizing. Your discussion is about dialogue. People come to their own understanding, and even if they don't understand, just like the Zapatista movement. That's what's very interesting. You had 30,000 Mayan people who didn't get along. Just because they were Mayan didn't mean they're going to get along right away. You had Protestant Mayans, you had Catholic Mayans, you had traditional Mayans, you had little feuds. But what the whole thing was that they started discussing, okay, look, since we are this little community, let's at least come to a consensus. Let's figure out how we practice direct democracy. So like, even in your own community, your own block, getting a garden, for example, that's going to help the economics of them having to go to the produce and buy a GMO tomato or whatever. So this, and whenever you harvest it, everyone works it together. Hey, let's work it out where, okay, you feed the tomatoes, on Tuesday, and then I'll do Wednesday. But then at the end, we're all like, in other words, set example on your block, without talking about just any isms, but just having a place for dialogue. And then from that point, that's where we try to, because discuss things, kind of move in silence about really what you're trying to do is really build community and dialogue and understanding, and a connection of community and resistance and autonomy, because it's really about creating your own autonomous region. Like, imagine if we became self-sufficient, even with solar power. Like, even with a friend who read about Nikola Tesla. Like, Nikola Tesla, he had already, and apparently there's plans out there. I know it probably sounds way out to you, but there's these, you can actually harness the magnetic field, and it gives you free energy. Imagine if we were able to get that together and start, like, what, F this DWP, on this block, do you feel me? Like, we had to think of creative ways of engaging people in simple survival. People, because that's how you can go to knock on the door and be like, instead of going knock on the door, hey, come to this anarchist rally, yet they're trying to feed their kids. You're gonna be like, hey, I'm collecting water, or hey, I got this avocado tree, and here, blah blah blah, or I'm a help. You don't have to pay no DWP bills. You know what I'm saying? Like, just in that way, like, just getting the discussion with your block, I think, is a good way of us. All of us, imagine if all of us started saying, okay, I'm gonna go my block, and then all of a sudden pretty soon you link all the blocks, like, it'd be sick, you know what I mean? But anyway, maybe I'm a dreamer, but that's what it's, we gotta think different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I've seen that a lot of isms sometimes don't create that initial spark. Like on my block, there was like about a week ago, one of my neighbors organized a block party, and I saw a gang of things happen just with that event alone that I haven't seen happen with, all these ideas of, go out there, start a revolution, anarchist rally, blah, blah, we're gonna tear this shit up. It set the ground for people to really start engaging one another, get familiar with who their neighbors are, and they start talking, see what they have in common. And now when you roll down the street, who's got how many kids, that's her kids, his kids. Everybody knows each other, and something happens, everyone's looking out for each other, and that kind of sets the groundwork into what we're actually trying to build versus just going out there and being like, anarchism this, revolutionary that, and it kind of like, whoa, what are you talking about? I'm not ready for that, but I think that's a lot of good points. But yeah, now we're gonna kind of usually the audience asks questions to the panelists, but this time the panelists are gonna ask questions to the audience. It's kind of different, but are you guys ready? Yeah? All right. So, do you guys want to ask the first question?
Sure, man.
Yes. Basically, this is in terms of flipping it back, like what do folks, what we talked about here in terms of what is, well, does everybody know what white privilege is? I know maybe that's some shit we should have even asked at the very beginning, but now, after this dialogue, what do you think it is? That by the virtue of the color of the skin, I don't need my. No, use the microphone. I'll be behind you so everybody can hear you.
Red Volvo is blocking.
Someone's car, someone's just trying to get out.
Oh, so there's a red Volvo blocking someone's car.
So you asked me what I thought white privilege was. Just those two words together. I think it means by the virtue of somebody having just white skin, being a white person, they are automatically in a privileged class that other people who are not white are not in. Am I right?
Anybody else have something else to add to it?
Look, I was adopted into a family of color. And when my brother and I walked down the street in our neighborhood, and we get stopped by the police, I'm pushed up against the car a little bit. I'm not really messing with it. My brother automatically, literally, they're dropping his pants, checking with drugs. But they're not even doing that to me. That's a privilege. And that's real. So, yeah, that's why privilege.
That was the start of it's not to put anybody on blast. If you don't know, that's the whole point of us fucking even having this space is to we want to put it out there because this is the shit that is not spoken about. We live in a white supremacist society. White privilege is the nice way of saying it. White privilege is the shit that is everyday life for white people. And so we're just putting it out there because in the sense, as people of color, this is the shit where we have to deal with every day, where it's we have to have the look behind our back, that paranoia of some shit that you don't have these privileges. But then we do have certain privileges as far as the different spaces we travel, different even as people of color, light skin privilege, different things. But as far as educating ourselves, because I'm putting it out there as far as trying to find out what people think about white privilege, just to get a sense now that you've heard us speaking about this, because most of the time when folks try to organize a panel that's about anarchist people of color, angry people of color, a people of color space, like Sherman said, there's always going to be a white anarchist talking shit. Why is that? This is divisive. They want to invade a space that's not, and so now it's just flipping it, where it's what do you think? What do you feel about that? And what would be your response? Or is there somebody that feels that, this space is divisive or whatever?
talk more about white privilege because I recently got back from Egypt. And there's a lot of, I was surrounded by international students. Most of them were white, going there to learn Arabic, to join the FBI, to join the Department of Homeland Security. And a lot of them, what I saw was that they saw, people of color, specifically those living in the so-called third world, as like research subjects. Like that they're exotic and that they're gonna go see, why do they do this and why do they do that and do that? And it was really frustrating because one of the women, she was writing about why women wear the hijab or the Muslim veil that Muslim women wear. And there's thousands of books on this, thousands of articles, and no one talks about, for example, why women wear high heels in the West, Not that that just happens in the West, but the level of analysis that they place on people of color is something that's not really projected onto white people or those living in the first world. So I just want to point out to that type of privilege where you can go in and say I'm gonna write research about this community and assume that this means that and not actually asking them what it means, just defining it for them. And just one last point, when I was there and one of the Egyptian guys asked me what are you studying? And I told him the Middle East. He told me, oh, okay, tell me about myself. And I thought that was a really good point. He called me out, and I was glad that he did that because it was embarrassing, but he's right. Oh, I'm majoring in the Middle East. What does that even mean, But anyway.
The whole concept of white privilege is really interesting to me because I have a Mexican father and a white mother. And my father is a Mexican citizen, but I don't look it. And so then there's this conflict where I understand very, very well, I think, that I'm pretty privileged. And I say it, I discuss it openly a lot, actually. I tell people that I'm very privileged. I'm privileged because of the work I get to do. I'm privileged that I get to be my own boss and grow food for a living. And do a lot of really great things. I got to have a lot of really great opportunities. And then on top of that, I get treated differently because of how I look. And a lot of people seem to feel uncomfortable, especially if I'm talking to other white people about being privileged and then kind of confronting them with our privilege. And I think that it is really important to get out of that colonial mindset of being condescending, being arrogant, and feeling like because I have privilege, I'm going to start to move things around the way I think they need to be fixed. And in a lot of ways, I think I have done it too, unintentionally, but retrospectively, I can see, as I get older, more and more aware I've made those mistakes. So I think that it's important to get out of that colonial mindset where you think that you have to go in and do all this radical stuff with the intention of almost getting attention for it. It's a lot of people, my criticism of direct action activism. A lot of the time, it's more about getting your activism badge than it is about achieving something real. And my work is in trying to develop alternative networks and alternative economies, like what we're discussing. My work is in addressing food security, and it's not about telling people, hey, this is what you have to eat and this is what you got to do. But it's more I'm trying to create something by myself and invite others later on to participate in it, and give people an alternative more than force them to do, play out your idea. It's not about forcing others to play out what you think is a great idea, but rather work on it yourself as much as you can and then give people an alternative way of living. And I think that's the responsible way to utilize privilege. I think is not necessarily. When you enfranchise others, you don't do it in a hegemonic way.
Just a quick notice, we got to end this at 4 o'clock, and we got time for about a couple more questions or feedback from the audience, if anyone has any. Go on.
So, I think one thing to realize too is not how white privilege affect, it's not just white privilege and then a community of people of color, it's what white privilege causes in the community of people of color. Just like people still have the notion of they want to aspire to get those privileges within that community of people of color, and then it creates conflicts in that community. So you get people, even cops, brown cops, black cops going into their own community which they come from, and they have to prove themselves, saying that they got out of that, position where they were at. So it's not only looking at like white folks as like, they have this privilege, is what also happens within the community or the realm of people of color. I just wanted to say that really quick.
So I thought it was gonna be bad one time because I grew up in the South, and in the South, the police forces in the South, they were pretty much like they generated back in the day the police, brown and black people, especially in Texas because Mexico's right there, and so you had a lot of white supremacists who went into these agencies and got jobs as police officers. So growing up, I started driving at 15, and about once a year I would get pulled over, okay? Now mind you, my dad's a white man, which is like really complicated and has a lot of self-hate issues. He does and I do too, but we kind of bond over this a little bit. But one time when I was pulled over, I was gonna like mess with the cop and like try to pull my white privilege, okay? So he pulled me over, right? And I looked at the officer, and my friends were in the back of the car, mind you, white punk rock friends. That's how I got into anarchism. So we're in a suburban, I'm driving my Lincoln, okay, so my big boat, all my everybody's in the car. The police officer pulls me over, and I'm like, how dare you? How dare you pull me over? Do you know who you're talking to? Do you know who you are talking to? And I had this white voice that I use sometimes, and I was like, officer, I am a white man, okay? You may not see it, but I am a white man. That didn't really fly too well. He still had me get out the vehicle, and I kid you not, the first thing he asked me is, oh, you trying to be funny? Well, do you have any bazookas, hand grenades, automatic fire weapons, or any kind of pistol, anything on you? And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, spread your legs. And my white privilege, is kind of out the door. So I think, even though we have these really complex histories, there's a mainstream world that really benefits a certain kind of person, and just being mindful of that. And I think, because I think one thing too, a lot of white anarchists ask me, well, what can I do with my privilege? And I tell them, well, be mindful of that, and learn that you take up space, and you're given space regardless if you want it or not. And I use this in dating because a lot of circles, you meet the queer anarchist person who's white, and they seem to have their pick of everyone. They can go into so many spaces, date anyone they want to, but there's the white supremacist world to where it's bad to be brown. It's bad to be brown. The color of your skin can mean that you don't get a second date, and that's something that a lot of white queer anarchist folks don't understand. And so I ask people to be mindful that your dating pool may be 1 million people, but for people of color, especially queer people of color, especially trans people of color, especially women people of color who are in these circles, your dating circles are very, very small, and just be mindful of that when you go out there and do your thing.